So I think we just wait maybe one more minute for anybody else to join, and then we'll kick off the session.
Thanks, Neil.
Late, that's fine, because they can do the reruns and our notes will be available to them. Okay, good afternoon everybody, and thanks for joining us. I'm Neil Strickland. We're also joined by my partner Larendee and Roos, who will be speaking to you in just a moment. This is the second of 4 webinars in our Leadership Challenge series. Last week we talked about principles that great leaders live and the continuum that stretches from low achieving managers to high performing leaders. We enjoyed the feedback and questions from participants and welcome you back this afternoon. If you missed us last week, we sent out copies of a mind map to all of those who registered, and this detailed the subject matter of the webinar. If anyone joining us for the first time this afternoon would like a copy of the notes, just drop us an email and we'll send them on to you. We've also uploaded a rerun on the Roos Consulting website for those of you that would like to hear it again. We want these sessions to be interactive in nature and welcome observations, questions and commentary from participants. Simply type your comments or questions into the text box at the bottom of the webinar control panel and we'll be happy to engage with you. If you have a burning question you wish to raise outside of this webinar, feel free to email us at info@roosconsulting.com. If you experience technical difficulties during the webinar, please phone Julie on 917-689-9895. This evening, Larendee will speak for about 10 minutes, sharing her wisdom about practical strategies we have observed that build great teams. We'll then throw it open to the floor for your comments or questions for a further 10 minutes. After that, I will speak for 10 minutes about a dozen things that leaders should avoid if they want to build great teams, and this will be followed by 10 minutes of Q&A as well. We will then summarize, check to make sure you got value from this session, and we'll close off at around the 45-minute mark. Without any further delay, I'm delighted to invite Larendee to speak with you now.
Thank you, Neil. So I also want to add my welcome and thank you for spending some time with us this afternoon and for allowing us to be a part of your journey. I am completely energized when I talk about and talk with leaders. And I especially love when we can talk about specific practical strategies that help us build great teams. Because it's one thing to talk about hypothesis, and it's a great thing to talk about philosophies. It's another thing to actually take practical, tactical strategies and implement those and then see what happens as those strategies are applied and we start to see the team take shape in new and profound ways. On another note, it is Rosh Hashanah today, and one of my colleagues was reminding me that it's not simply a Jewish holiday, but it's really a spiritual holiday for many organizations, and the whole idea and the whole concept behind it is fresh, new energy being breathed into the universal language, irrespective of what spiritual methodology you practice or don't practice. So with that today, we're going to kind of talk about, hopefully this will be some fresh energy for our participants and for ourselves and great reminders on things that we can do practically to build our teams. So one of the first things that we can do and that I believe is really important is consistency. And in that consistency, one of the things that is very important is that we have consistent team meetings. So what should those team meetings look like, and how should we execute on those? And if you're like myself, there probably was a point in your life, and it probably occasionally still happens again, where we know we have a meeting coming up and we don't plan as well, and then we get to the meeting and we wonder why there's what I kind of like to call organized chaos. So if we want to really take our teams to the next level and we want to build great teams, we need to have pre-planned agendas. And the people that are participating in those team meetings need to know what is going to be expected of them, needs to know what's on the agenda so that they can come and bring their best selves to the table as well. We need to, in those meetings, hold our teams accountable. we need to hold ourselves accountable, and we need to hold the leaders within our teams accountable. So if there are specific tasks or projects that we're trying to get it down the road, it's important that we have specific projects, specific tasks where a time is assigned to those, even to the point of maybe a date. So for example, if I'm trying to roll out a new marketing initiative and I give that to my director of marketing to do the research on, and then from that research we'll make a decision and implement a program, we're going to understand as a team, based on what the director of marketing is going to present, what the objective is, what the deliverables are, and by what date each of those will be delivered. So the accountability is report-driven, and there's individual responsibilities, and then there's team accountability and responsibility. Now what we're not going to do is tell the director of marketing how he's going to hold his team accountable. We as a leadership team are going to hold the director of marketing accountable, and then as we model that kind of accountability, then he will hopefully breed that down into his team. But it's also report-driven in that especially, and I encourage weekly meetings, so if our team is having weekly meetings, and I call them collaboration meetings, then the director of marketing will report and have a certain segment of time where he reports on the progress that his team is making. This way, we're not seeing emails fly back and forth every day. We're not micromanaging, but we're entrusting the process to someone that presumably is qualified to do the job, has proven themselves accountable and responsible, and then we're just working with them to provide input, feedback, and to be a good support system for that person. So I use the director of marketing idea, but it could be, potentially in your human resource department if you are rolling out a new initiative. Every year, typically companies have to look at compensation and benefit plans. So the same type of thing. This way, the upper leadership or the higher leadership knows what's going on without being down into the minutiae and the micromanagement. The other thing I always like to put out to the team is, if you were CEO for a day, what would you do differently? And it's always really interesting in direct reports in senior management, but also in rank and file. A lot of really good ideas can come out of that. And then those are things that you can bring back to the team meetings and process amongst your director level, potentially your director level people. So we'll throw it open to the floor now to talk about that specific, the consistent team meetings, and then we'll go into the one-on-one meetings in a few minutes. We do have one question: why do some meetings I have get so unruly even when people have clear directions on what they're supposed to do? Why do some meetings I have get so unruly? It's been my experience. Neil, is it okay if I take this question, then I'll pass it to you?
Of course, yeah.
Okay,
Keep going.
So it's been my experience that if my meetings are unruly or disorganized, it's because I haven't set a clear agenda for what the meeting, how the meeting is supposed to look, and then hold people accountable back to that. A great example is like today, how Neil laid out, okay, here's what we're going to talk about, here's the structure with which we're going to do it, and then we follow that structure. This is also makes it so that we don't get off on tangents that take us too far off path. The other thing is that sometimes what can happen in team meetings is people decide that they finally have the CEO's attention that they haven't had for over a week. So they're going to use that format to get all of their questions answered. And if we're having consistent one-on-one meetings, which we'll get more into down below, that need for not paying attention and not staying more strictly focused on the agenda kind of self-resolves. So, Neil, did you have any thoughts on that?
Just a comment that if your whole team is in alignment with what the expectations are of the leader, the meetings tend not to be problematic. It's when you have too many diverse opinions about the way forward and not a clear sense of direction, you get a lot of noise on the line. So you know, I don't believe in meetings about meetings. I think they need to be practical. I think they need to be signaled in advance what the rules of the meeting are and what your expectations from participants are. So once those kind of parameters are agreed up front, unruliness tends not to crop up quite so often.
It's true. I hope, was that helpful for you? Is there any other questions that you would have on that? You know, the other thing is that I think as leaders, we need not be afraid of conflict or differing opinions, right? Because sometimes that differing opinion is just what's needed to get us off center. So many of you may or may not know that I spent about 18 years in a very corporate environment, and that environment changed dramatically over the course of 18 years. We started as a very small organization, and by the time I left, we had close to 800 employees. And so as you can just imagine, by that growth and the depth of that organization, the playing field changed a little bit. And there were times as we were going through that rapid growth, and also I've experienced in companies that I've been working with since then, that whenever change is brought to the forefront, there's going to be different opinions. But as Neil spoke to, we can have rules of engagement where we can have different opinions and still act respectfully to move the process forward in a positive way. Sometimes as leaders we shy away from what we consider conflict, when really it's just varying opinions, and sometimes the opposite is exactly what's needed in order to flush out, you know, and get us, you know, off center and out of our comfort zone to do what's necessary for the organization. So, okay, so I'm glad that was helpful. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to consistent one-on-one meetings. So the purpose of one-on-one meetings, and again, I think they need to be consistent. So if you tell your team, as the CEO, you're going to have your team meetings or your executive meetings where everyone who reports directly to you is going to meet in a collaborative environment. But the one-on-one meetings are held aside for agenda items that don't require what I call the brain space of all of your senior reports or all of your managers. These are meetings that directly affect your department or one individual's department that need more kind of one-on-one direction. So for example, if I'm the CEO of an organization and I have a senior vice president of acquisitions and a senior vice president of development and a senior vice president of operations and marketing and human resources, I might invite those all to my team meetings, but I may not have to, it may not be necessary for the senior vice president of human resources to give at the higher team level everything that's going on his agenda. What the senior vice president of human resources would bring is anything that would need buy-in from the whole team. So I save one-on-one meetings for issues and for agenda items that affect only that team member and that team member is direct. So for example, I'm working with an organization right now where we're having to develop job descriptions and accountability for every single person within that organization. So I have team meetings with the operations and receiving department, the accounting department, and the customer service department, but I don't waste the operations and receiving's time dealing with issues that are only appropriate for the customer service team. Then the customer service person can bring back to the larger team meeting anything that's going to affect the organization as a whole. Does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions on that?
Okay. If I can just comment on it as well, Larendee. My own feeling on it, having as well worked in a corporate environment for over 20 years, meetings don't always require structure. Way back in the 80s when I was in college, I read a great book called In Search of Excellence, which I'm sure you know about, And within that, they talked about managing by walking about. And I think I mentioned this in our last session last week. There's a huge amount of data you can gather while walking the floor as a CEO and talking to everybody. I don't think it's a good idea just to deal with your direct reports, because you don't get the real pulse of the organization if you confine yourself to your direct reports. If you talk to everybody at every level informally as you walk the floor, you really do get a sense of the pulse of the organization, and people will contribute if they're not punished for doing so. So the trick is to be a good listener, that you're not always out there to speak first, but you're there to listen first.
That's true. You know, Neil, I was at one of my clients yesterday, and they had a gentleman who was washing trucks. And I walked up to him and asked him how that was going for him. And he said, well, I completed 10 in 3 hours. And he was really proud of that. And I said, oh, show me what you did. And as he took me over and showed me, he was really quite proud of, you know, the fact that he was able to accomplish so much in such a short period of time. And I asked him if the person who had given him the assignment, if he had had a chance to look at it, and he said, no, he never comes and checks on my work. So, you know, what that breeds is a couple of things. One, for the less reputable employee, that they might slack a little bit, and for the more reputable employee, there might be a certain sense of that what I do isn't that important because the person that I report to doesn't really ever check on me and give me feedback. So to your point, I'm a huge proponent of MBW, management by walking around, and that it needs to be important in every organization, and that a CEO walking up to a rank and file member, he can learn as much as he can sitting in that team meeting about changes that need to be made in his organization. So, okay. Finally, I'm just going to touch briefly on the specifics. So again, we always begin with the end in mind. We want to talk about whether we're managing by walking around or whether we're in team meetings. Is what's the end objective, and what needs to be on that agenda. What questions do I need to ask in order to figure out to get to my end game? And then measure as you go, and define what those measurables are, and then measure it. So what gets measured gets done, and what we measure and what we accomplish through measurement should be celebrated and should be rewarded. So we need to be consistently evaluating our performance against those metrics, and every metric is going to be different. So someone, you know, sometimes I get the question from CEOs, well, how do I put that metric in place? And so we have to back up. What are we trying to accomplish? In which department are we trying to accomplish it? Because the metrics for the receivables department is going to look different than the metrics for the sales department. And then set the course, follow up for a while, and then make adjustments. And as a great leader, many of the leaders that I've worked with, and I know within myself too, we tend to get impatient and we don't want to wait for the process. And one of the biggest things that I've learned is that to make a decision, walk with that decision long enough to truly find out if a revision needs to be made, and then make the revision once we have consensus again. So to the very bottom, easy does it, and honor the process. Allow yourself, allow your teams the benefit of honoring and walking with that process, because you will learn more and it will develop less neurotic organizations, as it were, than if I come in on Monday, set a pace for a different course of action, and by Wednesday it's not working, I go a different direction. It takes more time than 48 hours for most systems to be implemented and for us to see the results one way or the other of systems and the actions that we put into place. So I'll open it up to the floor again. Les Neil, if you have any comments on that, we'll open it up for any questions.
I just want to make one or two comments. You and I are great readers on organizations and on leaders out there who do a great job. You and I were great admirers of the late Stephen Covey, and within the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, there are a couple of things that he said in there which have resonance with me in particular. And the first one is, seek first to understand, then to be understood. which really sits well with what we've just talked about at the end of the day, that you're out there to listen rather than just enforce your views on everybody else. And in that way, you're a learning leader and you're going to perform an awful lot better. And the second thing that he talked about that resonates with me is the idea of empathic communication. That you show that you understand what people are talking about, that you care about the contribution that they have to make, and that you show respect and take account of them. And in that situation, they don't feel threatened, and it's win-win. And this is something Stephen was very strong on as well, that all relationships, whether they're externally focused outside of your organization or internally between colleagues, it's always got to be win-win, or win-win or walk, as he calls it.
That's a great point. We had a question from the floor. I put the performance requirements in place, but I'm still not seeing my expected results. Why? Do you want to take that one, Neil?
Yeah, there could be a number of different reasons for that at the end of the day. I mean, when you're setting your objectives and your goals for people in particular, you've got to use SMART goals. As we all know, they're specific, they're measurable, they're achievable, they're reasonable, and that they're time-bound. If you don't actually put together the performance objectives in that kind of format, there can be confusion on the line. Expectations may not be clearly understood. People may think you're setting the bar too high. So you really need to have a regular review process to check each of the SMART initiatives to make sure that you're on track with your colleagues and your subordinates in particular, and that there's good understanding between you. And in that way, performance requirements will get met, and in fact, you will find as time goes on, performance gets ratcheted up. At every time you do a review, you know, you congratulate people on their successes, and they tend to work harder as a result of that. So it's all about having really clearly understood and mutually agreed performance objectives for everybody. Unless you want to contribute something else to that?
No, I think that's true. I think that again, setting the pace at the front, and then human beings are required to execute on all of this, including ourselves. And just as I don't do everything perfectly and won't do everything perfectly, and we need to have the same kind of empathy to the process and to our teams, and continue to bring our teams back to the standard that presumably we all got on the same page in the first place. So we get on the same page by setting those SMART goals that you just talked about. Then we march down the path, and if something gets off center, we go back to the page and say, where are we off track? What's going on here? And we also have to admit that sometimes people have differing opinions, such that if it becomes so different than the pace of the rest of the team, then it might be time for them to make a decision that this isn't the team they want to belong to anymore. And I think that also, we're not firing people, we're allowing people to, we're not reassigning people, we're allowing people to, as being an honest part of the process, decide if this is still the team that they want to play on too. So hopefully was that helpful? Okay, it says,
I think that's fine.
Very helpful. Great. Okay, so Neil, why don't you go ahead and take us on to the next level?
Okay. I, as you know, have been involved in business for 35 years, 20 of them within a corporate setting, and the last 14 or so working within small and medium businesses. And just to be real about our conversation this evening here, I wanted to highlight some of the negative things that leaders should avoid and which can be destructive to teams. And I'm sure some of our participants tonight will actually recognize some of these things. So the next dozen things I'm going to talk about are things you should not do rather than things you should do, which you addressed, Larendee. So the first one that is really, really common out there is leaders that run after every bouncing ball. I mean, one of the tenets of good business management has always been to stick to the knitting. In other words, find out what you're really good at and concentrate on doing that supremely well. There are an extraordinary number of business owners that could be compared to the dog in the fable about the dog with the bone. They may have a solid business, but they spot something else which is more glamorous, and they divert their teams and resources into that. Many do it again and again in pursuit of the elusive pot of gold and only succeed in damaging their core business. So that's kind of top of my list of 1 dozen. It's down to lack of focus at the end of the day, and very destructive to teams. The second one that I usually list in my order of a dozen is hiring people just like themselves. CEOs often interview people for jobs and identify with a lot of what the people have in their characters, and it doesn't always work out. I mean, it seems obvious that you should always hire the best person for any job you're trying to fill. However, many business owners and leaders don't use objective scoring methods during interviews, which should deliver the best qualified person for the job based on their comparative score. Instead, they often focus on gut instinct and make decisions based on seeing traits in individuals which are part of their own makeup, and the results are usually disastrous. Before I move on to the next couple, Larendee, maybe you'd like to comment, or is there anybody out there who wants to say anything before I hit number 3? There's a comment there from somebody, oh my God, I do this. So I'm glad this resonates with somebody out there. Okay, moving on. The third one that I would put on the list of sins is a leader that spends all their time watching over the shoulders of staff. Now, this can be not just a leader at the top of the organization, but leaders or managers further down the tree. Of all the sins a business owner or manager may commit, I think it's one of the worst ways to spend their time, directing individuals on how they should be doing their job. Most people at the end of the day respond positively to autonomy and generally will do a far better job if they're not being constantly watched and undermined by the boss. Again, it's another very destructive one for teams. Moving on to number 4 before we ask a question again, is losing sight of the big picture due to focusing on minutiae. It's similar to the last one. Micromanaging can be compounded by the boss losing sight of the big picture because he or she is so far down in the trenches. Perhaps, Larendee, you've seen that in some of the organizations you've looked at as well.
Yeah, what happens in some of the organizations that I've worked with is very often comes from a fear of the CEO or the manager of losing control. And one of the things that I constantly preach to the people that I work with is that we have to let go in order to grow. And there are some things that we need to keep very good oversight on, obviously our finances, the way the money's spent in our organization, especially if we're a small organization. But there are a lot of things that if we've put the right expectations and we've put the right modules or models in place, that we're hiring people who can take that ball and run with it farther and faster than we could if we were just doing it ourselves. But what often happens is our fear and our desire to control all the outcomes, then we smother our teams, right? Or we unwittingly smother and hamper the efforts because we're second-guessing every step of the way. And what happens is it makes for neurotic relationships within the environment instead of thriving, organic, naturally flowing relationships. And, you know, we talked about this last week, Neil, that the best way that we can all sleep well at night is to know what the objectives and the vision is for our organizations, point people back to that, and then trust them and ask them, hold them accountable to fulfilling that vision. And then how they do that shouldn't be micromanaged by us. If we have to have that much control, then it's there's probably something wrong with our model, and it might even be our internal model. So
it can be very common as businesses grow from being smaller to being larger organizations. We have a comment in from a contributor here who says, I get so frustrated with my team that a job isn't getting done, or I have to explain everything that is just faster for me to just do it myself rather than take the time to instruct people on how to do the job. Again, my next point about making decisions on instinct alone plays into that particular question or observation. I mean, when a business is new and in the early stages of development, the owner commonly makes many gut decisions, and that's perfectly okay. Some work out fine, but as a business grows, becomes more complex, and the stakes gets higher, it's vitally important that the owner gathers together all the information available and then objectively assesses what the correct decision might be. He should seek advice from colleagues and consider all of the risk factors before making a final determination for all key decisions. Doing it for your employee is not going to allow them to self-actualize, if you want to call it that. The best kind of managers and leaders point people in the right direction and then stand back and let them do it whatever way is best for them. I hope that answers that particular question. Moving on to another common failing is failing to plan for the future. It's very common for many businesses to drift along without a well-thought-out business plan. This is almost as ludicrous as trying to navigate your way around the world without bringing a map along. A business plan is your roadmap for your business. So everybody out there needs to have a plan, and it's not something that's static that can't be changed over time. It's something that actually should be reflected on a regular basis and updated to take account of market dynamics and what's happening within your own organization. So failing to plan is planning to fail. The next one on my to-do list or not to-do list is something that an awful lot of leaders can do, again in the early stages of the business, spending working capital on fixed assets. It may well be very tempting to purchase a piece of machinery, a vehicle, a building, or even another business when you have a healthy bank balance sitting in your business bank account. This is something you should never contemplate. An asset needs to be financed over its useful working life and not bought for cash. Again, you have to drill this kind of knowledge down into your teams so that you know, they're learning from the best behaviors from the managers and leaders in the business rather than just going it alone and making the wrong kind of decisions. Okay, moving on then. This is another pet one of mine. It's managers and leaders or team leaders that assume they have all of the answers. I've worked with many owners and managers in large and small businesses over my working life, and the echo of them saying they are the boss and they're always right brings a shudder to my spine. Nobody has all the answers, and pride comes before a fall. It's ludicrous to think that the leader has all the answers. So you need a team around you that contribute their best ideas so that you can do the right kind of things within your business. And another one you often see in family-owned businesses is bringing in family members to hold key positions in the business. Many entrepreneurial businesses that we deal with are family-owned and run. It's a tremendous mistake, however, to place a family member in a key role simply because they are family. If they don't have the skill set for the role you need to fill, then get in a professional to do the job. Any comments before I talk about the last two, Larendee?
No, I was just going to say, something that's, one of the corporate environment that I left 10 years ago before I opened my consulting practice, speaking to that point, was very often when we bring key family members in, there's an unintended consequence too that, in fact, that person might be the best person for the job. However, getting consensus among the already existing team is really important and key, because without that, the family member, it's almost like them operating with one hand tied behind their back. There's somewhat of a just kind of unwritten idea that if a family member comes in, he must have earned it based on his pedigree and not on merit alone. So if you're going to bring a family member in, and by the way, one of my key executives was the son to the CEO, and I have to tell you, he was one of the most, brightest people that I worked with, and just an amazing asset to our team. But before I brought him in, I got consensus from the team prior so that if ever came up where pedigree was brought to the table, it was a non-issue. So I think just understanding how to navigate that, if that's a decision that you make, is also important. I have a question for you, Neil. Back on when you were talking about planning for the future and what to spend your money on, what's your view on if an organization has a pretty healthy balance sheet, so for example, they have $200,000 in cash, they have $175,000 in receivables, that is, most of the receivables are under 60 days, so it's just by virtue of them always having a lot of invoices out, but not overdue. And they have a small amount of debt. Let's say they have $20,000 in a loan. What would be your advice? Would you recommend they pay off the loan first, or would you recommend that they take some of that $200,000 that's sitting in the bank account and invest it first before paying off that $20,000? What would be your advice?
It really depends what the loan was for. I mean, if you go back to the earlier point that I made, you finance purchases for the business based on their useful life. So, for example, if that $20,000 loan was to buy computer equipment and it's depreciated over a 5-year period, it'd be madness to pay that off ahead of time just because you have cash sitting in the bank. So it really goes back to that core issue, is what was the loan for, and what's the useful life of the asset that was purchased. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think because it's something that comes up frequently, because with the economy the way it is, many business owners are so debt adverse. But on the other hand, when you have $200,000 sitting in a bank account earning less than 1%, if any interest at all, you have a loan that's only costing you 5% or 4% in some cases, and you only need $100,000 worst case to operate your business. You basically have $100,000 sitting there and really not working for the business or the business owner. So,
again, it's going to be dependent on the direction of the business and whether it's working capital intensive. I mean, if at the end of the day there's no foreseeable use of the capital, and you always have a large balance sitting in your checking account or in a low yield deposit account, if you don't want to put it out there into bonds, which will give you a guaranteed return, yeah, you could consider getting rid of the loan, but things change over time. And in this particular environment where banks like to give you an umbrella when it's a nice sunny day, and then when it's raining they take it back. So if you've got good lines of credit out there and you can pull on that or call on that at a time that you need in the future, and you've got this irritating little loan there, by all means get rid of it. But in general, as an ex-banker, I mean, I was 20 years in that particular game, it was always about separating the two different sides of your balance sheet when it came to loans and deposits. And the metric always used out there was what's the useful life of the asset. 20 grand loan at 5%. What's the saving going to be on that? It's a small amount of money.
Right. Okay. Let's go ahead and have you finish up, Neil. We have about 10 minutes left, 6 minutes left. Yeah.
Okay. There are just two left in this particular section, as you can see in front of you. One of them is frequently changing direction of the business, and this one is similar to running after every hopping ball. However, if you have a clear business plan, you're less likely to engage in this kind of dysfunctional behavior. I mean, what you need to do is finish what you start and only make minor course adjustments as your journey progresses. And the last one in the dirty dozen, as I call them, is giving mixed messages to staff. Leading and managing people can be more art than craft. It's important that you set a clear direction for your colleagues and subordinates, and that you periodically review performance with them on a one-to-one basis. But you need to try and resist the temptation to send them racing off in one direction today, another one tomorrow, and a totally different direction next week. It only leads to confusion and subpar performance, and it can be detrimental to your business. Again, that's the last in the dirty dozen. Again, any questions out there from anybody, or any commentary from you, Larendee?
No, I think that's true, and especially when we're going through tough times in our business, as every business does go through highs and lows. It's kind of the natural instinct is to, as you said, start looking at, do I need to change direction? Do I need to follow a different ball? And I think focus is most important when we're in the tough times, in truth. But it's not something that always feels natural. So, okay, so maybe we can get some feedback from the participants on anything that they found most useful. Maybe what's worked well for your organizations, or any specific challenges that you're facing that we haven't already addressed. And if not that, what was the most helpful thing that you learned from this webinar? Maybe, Neil, you and I can start off about any takeaways that we learned just through this process today while we're waiting for feedback from the floor. So I will jump in and say that a good reminder for me was not to chase those bouncing balls, and to be very focused in who I am, what I'm about, why I do what I do, and then I will serve those I'm meant to serve in the segments that I'm supposed to serve, and just to trust the process. Okay. How about you, Neil?
Again, I'd like to highlight that leaders and managers in the businesses that we normally deal with, they need to develop an appetite for reading if they don't already have it. And I'd like, as part of what we do, to recommend a number of books as we go through our sessions here that people will learn from and can build into their daily work lives. I mentioned earlier on the book by Stephen Covey, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. You know, it's a user manual for a leader or a manager, and I thoroughly recommend that one. But going back further than that, to Napoleon Hill, who wrote Think and Go Rich back in 1937, and a subsequent book written by his foundation in the early 70s after Napoleon had passed away, and it's Napoleon Hill's Keys to Success. They're really useful books to have in your library and to share around your organization. Really conscious that we're running out of time here. Before we go, I'd just like to thank everybody for participating, and to let you know session 3 at the same time next week, the 12th of September, is about Know Thy Customer and Love 'Em. It looks at Customer Service 101. It looks at your mentor, Michael Port, Larendee, and you'll be able to talk about what a wonderful example he is out there for people that are trying to develop their organizations. And then some lessons from the heart. So from me tonight, I just want to say thank you, and I look forward to being of service again. And I pass it over to you, Larendee, for the final good night.
You bet. And another book that I found very helpful, Neil, early on in my management days was The 1 Minute Manager by Ken Blanchard. Also an excellent little handbook for any manager level person to also tap into. And looking forward to next week, we have some exciting things coming up as we continue to plan what these series will look like. And so continue to spread the word amongst your friends and family, and we really look forward to continuing to be part of your process. Until next week, thank you and have a great weekend.